Montana Territory, 1883. The wind blew sharp off the mountains that morning, carrying the dust of broken things. Mabel Whitlow wiped her brow with the hem of her sleeve, bent low over the woodpile behind the sheriff's office in Dry Creek. Her hands were blistered, her back ached, and the sun had barely cleared the pine tops. She had been working off her brother's fine for the past 3 weeks, $20 and 2 days in the jailhouse after he bloodied the local farrier's nose in a saloon fight. Tommy had bolted the next morning, leaving Mabel to clean up the mess. "Chop faster, girl," barked Deputy Laramie through a cracked window. "Sheriff wants that stove wood stacked by noon." Mabel swallowed hard and kept splitting the log beneath her hands. She had no money, no family but Tommy, and nowhere else to go. She was 22 and alone, and every day felt longer than the last. Across the street, a man on horseback slowed his gelding to a stop. He was tall in the saddle, wearing a plain cotton shirt and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded a face tanned deep from sun. He watched Mabel for a long moment, then swung down, dust puffing up around his boots when they hit the dirt. He tied his horse to the rail and stepped up onto the boardwalk, boots creaking against the planks. His eyes stayed on her as he crossed the street. "You always treat women like this here?" he asked the deputy, voice level but hard enough to carry. Deputy Laramie opened the door and stepped outside. "Ain't none of your concern, stranger." The man pulled off his hat and looked at Mabel. His eyes were green, clear like spring water, and his face had a kindness she had not seen in a long time. "She your prisoner?" he asked. "She's working off a fine," the deputy snapped. "Her brother caused a mess. She's paying for it." The man glanced back at Mabel. "How much?" $20. The man pulled a small roll of bills from his breast pocket, counted out the money, and set it on the rail. "She's free," he said. The deputy blinked. "You cannot just, she's free," the man repeated, voice edged now. Laramie snatched the bills, muttered something under his breath, and went back inside. Mabel stood still as stone, axe hanging loose in her hands. Her heart beat loud in her ears. "Why?" she asked. The man stepped closer and crouched to pick up her gloves. "You looked like you needed a way out," he said, holding them out to her. "Name's Ransom Ellery." She took the gloves from his hand. "Mabel Whitlow." "You got anywhere to go, Mabel?" She shook her head. "Well," he said, standing again, "I got a wagon headed west and a spare horse tied behind it. You are welcome to ride along. I could use someone who knows how to stack wood." Mabel stared at him, uncertain. "You do not even know me. I know you do not belong breaking your back for a man who ran off and left you to clean up after him." She swallowed again. Her throat felt tight. "I do not expect anything from you," he added. "Just offering a way out." She looked at her hands raw, cracked, and then at the empty street. The sound of the chopping block felt too loud now. "I will come," she said quietly. Ransom nodded once. "Good." They left that afternoon, Mabel tucked into the back of his wagon, sitting beside 2 sacks of oats and a crate of tools. His horse, a dark bay named Flint, followed behind, tied to the rear axle. The sky stretched wide above them, blue and endless. Ransom did not talk much, but when he did, his voice was calm and sure. He was heading toward the Bitterroot Valley, where he had bought a small plot of land near the river. He planned to build a home there, raise cattle, live quiet. "I've been on the trail too long," he said one evening as they camped beside a creek. "Time to root down." Mabel listened while stirring beans in the pot. "You always help strangers." "Not always," he said. "But I saw how you looked, like you were drowning slow." She did not know what to say to that. No one had ever noticed her like that before. The days passed soft and steady. Mabel helped cook, gathered firewood, and watched him work with his hands, tightening the wagon wheels, checking Flint's hooves, building a small shelter the night it rained. He never asked about her brother or how she ended up alone. He just kept making space for her. One night after they had crossed into the valley, she leaned against a tree and watched the firelight flicker across his face. He was sharpening a knife, slow and careful. "You paid my fine," she said. He looked up. "Why?" she asked again. He considered her for a moment. Then he set the knife down. "Because I want you to be free," he said. "Not just from the fine, from all of it." She felt her chest ache a little. "I do not know much about anything," she said, voice soft, "but I know I feel safe with you." His eyes met hers across the fire. "You are safe, Mabel." She nodded, tears stinging though she did not let them fall. When they reached his land, it was a wide stretch of meadow and pine with the Bitterroot River curling along the southern edge. He showed her where he planned to build the cabin, the barn, the corral. She helped him clear brush and carry stones. They slept in the wagon those first few nights, and on the fourth night she sat beside him on the tailgate, watching the sun fall behind the trees. "I never had much of a home," she said. "You do now," he said. She looked at him. "Why do you look at me like that?" "Like what?" "Like I matter." He took her hand in his rough palm against her fingers. "Because you do," he said. She leaned in before she could second-guess herself, and he met her halfway. The kiss was gentle, sure. When they pulled apart, his forehead rested against hers. "I have not smiled like this in years," she whispered. "You should get used to it," he murmured, and she did. The sound of the crosscut saw echoed through the trees, steady and sure, teeth biting into the pine as Ransom braced it with his boot. Mabel stood opposite him, sleeves rolled, hair tied back with a strip of muslin she'd cut from her old petticoat. Her arms burned from the weight of the work, but she didn't slow. They had cleared enough timber for the cabin's frame, dragging the logs with flint, and a harness Ransom had stitched together from mule straps. The days were long, the tools few, but the rhythm of labor settled into her like something remembered from another life, one where things grew instead of fell apart. Near midday, they stopped to eat. Mabel handed him a strip of dried venison wrapped in cheesecloth. He nodded his thanks, sitting on a stump with his knees wide, forearms resting loose. "You talk less than anyone I've ever met," she said. He tore off a bite and chewed before answering. "Most folks fill silence just to hear themselves." "I never saw the use. You always this quiet," he looked up at the sky, then at her. "Not always, but I've said too much in the past and none of it helped anything." She sat beside him. "You lost someone," he didn't answer right away. Just stared out past the trees where the river glinted through a break in the branches. "My brother," he said finally. "Broke his neck falling from a horse. I was supposed to be watching him. He was 12. Mabel turned slightly. "Ransom. I was 16, thought I knew everything. Told him he didn't need the saddle." She didn't reach for him, didn't speak, just waited. He pulled a twig from the ground and peeled it with his knife. "After that, I left home. Took jobs where I could, never stayed long, didn't figure I deserved to." Mabel's voice was low. "You don't owe a lifetime for one mistake." He tossed the stripped twig into the brush. "Feels like I do." She watched the wind move through the tree lines, soft and slow. The quiet that followed didn't push. It just rested between them. That night, they laid the first beams for the cabin floor. Mabel steadied the corners while Ransom hammered the pegs in by lantern light. His jaw was clenched from the effort, shirt soaked through at the back. "You're stubborn," she said as he drove the last peg with the heel of his boot. "Could have built a sod house and been done with it." He wiped his brow with the crook of his arm. "I wanted to stand. For who?" He looked at her, long and level. "For us." She didn't answer, but when he passed her the hammer, her hands didn't shake. Later, as they sat near the fire, Mabel worked a patch into the knee of his trousers. Her stitches were crooked, but they held. Ransom watched her hands move, calloused but careful. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked. She threaded the needle again. "I used to. Thought if I could get far enough, I'd stop feeling like I was always chasing something I'd never catch. And now," she paused, then tied off the thread. "Now I don't feel like I'm running." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I don't want you here because you feel like you owe me. I don't." "Then why stay?" She folded the cloth, set it beside her, and met his eyes. "Because it's the first place I've ever wanted to build something." He nodded once, quiet. They turned in early, the fire burning low. Ransom slept on a bedroll just beyond the wagon while Mabel curled beneath a wool blanket inside. The stars spun slow overhead, and somewhere in the trees, a great horned owl called out once, then went still. Just before sleep took her, she whispered into the dark, "You were right." I did need a way out, and from the other side of the canvas, his voice came low and steady. I needed one too. By the second week of September, the first frost kissed the edges of the meadow and turned the morning silver. Mabel rose before the sun now, pulling on wool stockings and wrapping a shawl around her shoulders before stepping outside. Ransom had left early to repair a post along the river fence, and she welcomed the quiet. She brought water from the creek, set it to boil, then knelt by the cabin foundation, smoothing a line of packed earth where the hearth would sit. The stones they'd hauled from the riverbed were stacked nearby, waiting to be mortared in. She traced the shape of the hearth's base with the edge of her boot, imagining the warmth it would throw once the walls stood and the chimney drew clean. Her hand drifted to her apron pocket, brushing against the folded square of paper tucked there. A receipt from the Dry Creek General Store, signed in Ransom's hand. He'd scribbled it absent-mindedly when tallying the cost of nails and hinges 2 days earlier, then left it behind on the wagon seat. She hadn't meant to keep it, but something about the way his name looked in ink firm without hesitation had stilled her. Footsteps snapped dry grass behind her. "You're smoothing dirt like it's a girl's braid," Ransom said. She stood, brushing her palms on her skirt. "It'll keep the hearth level." "If it's off now, it'll always burn crooked." He nodded, then gestured toward the trees. "Ran into a trapper upriver. Says a winter storm's coming fast from the northwest. We'll need to get the roof on before the week's out. I can help fit the rafters. I know." He handed her a strip of canvas to mend the wagon's torn side panel. She took it and they walked back toward camp together, boots soft in the frost-crisped grass. "Trapper ask about the land," she asked. He was more interested in the mule he sold last month being too stubborn to pack. She gave a short laugh. "Sounds like you two would get along." He glanced sideways. "I'm not that mule stubborn. You're building a 6-room cabin when we only sleep in one corner of a wagon." He didn't argue. Instead, he crouched beside the fire and adjusted the kettle with a stick. "I've been thinking," he said after a pause. "Once the roof's done, we should ride into Corvallis. There's a man there sells seed wheat, onions, potatoes. Could be planting by spring." "I've never planted anything from seed," she said. "Then you'll learn with me." She knelt to stir the oats. "Doesn't seem real, thinking about spring." "It will be." He didn't say anything else, but when she handed him a tin cup of coffee, his fingers brushed hers on purpose. That evening, they worked side by side under lantern light, lifting the first beams across the top frame. Mabel steadied the ladder while Ransom climbed and drove in pegs, his shoulders dark with sweat despite the cold. When he climbed down, he rested his hand briefly on her back, nothing bold, just a quiet press of thanks. She didn't move away. Later, after supper, she sat on the wagon tongue, needle in hand, patching a tear in her shawl. Ransom was oiling the hinges for the door they'd shaped from pine slabs. A thin line of smoke rose from the fire behind them, the smell of burnt beans still clinging to the air. "You ever think about going back?" she asked suddenly. He didn't look up. "To Oklahoma? No, nothing there, only graves." She set her shawl aside. "I used to think I'd find Tommy again. That maybe he'd write or show up on some stage line, sober and sorry. He might still." She shook her head. "If he was coming, he'd be here. He's always been good at leaving." Her voice thinned. "I don't know who I am without him to clean up after." Ransom wiped his hands on a cloth, then walked to where she sat. He crouched, knees wide, arms resting on his thighs. "You're the woman who carries stones half her size without complaint. You're the one who figured out how to keep the fire going all night without wasting wood. You're the reason this place is more than just timber and tools." She looked down at her hands. "You're not someone's shadow anymore," he said. She raised her eyes slowly. "And if I don't know how to be anything else, I'll wait," he said. "Until you find out." The wind shifted, pulling strands of her hair loose from the braid. He reached up and tucked them behind her ear, hand lingering just a breath too long. "Will you kiss me?" she asked, voice barely above the wind. He stood and offered her his hand. She took it and he pulled her gently to her feet. When he kissed her, it was slow and grounded, like everything he did. No rush, no question, just steady care. When they pulled apart, her cheek rested against his chest. "I don't want this to be something that fades," she murmured. "It won't," he said, and standing there with the half-built cabin behind them and a sky full of stars above, she believed him. The first snow came early, softening the forest in silence. Mabel stood at the edge of the field with a shovel in hand, watching the flakes settle against the dark wool of her skirt. The roof was on, the hearth was built, and the walls stood tight against the wind. Smoke curled from the chimney now, faint but steady. She hadn't known the smell of her own fire could bring such stillness to her chest. Behind her, Ransom was sawing through a length of scrapboard, measuring by eye and cutting by instinct. His coat hung open despite the cold, sleeves rolled back just far enough to show the leather cuffs he always wore stitched by hand, worn smooth from years of use. "You'll dull your blade in this wet," she said, not turning. "I've got another," he answered. "This one's near done anyhow." She tapped the shovel once against the frozen ground. "We should dig the root pit before the frost deepens. I'll help after I set the door brace." She nodded and started to walk back toward the cabin. "Mabel," he said behind her. She paused. "I was thinking about the porch," he went on. "Might be good to add one come spring, covered with a bench along the side." She turned her head. "You want to sit and watch the grass grow? I want to sit with you." Her lip caught between her teeth, but she didn't smile. She just nodded once. Inside, the light from the fire danced along the rough-hewn walls as she set the kettle on a hook over the flames. The warmth wrapped around her shoulders like a second shawl. She moved slowly now, not from weariness, but from the unfamiliar comfort of not needing to rush. When Ransom stepped in, he stamped the snow from his boots and hung his coat on the peg by the door. His hands were red from the cold, and he held them out toward the fire without speaking. She brought him a cup of broth, thick with barley and the last of the cured venison. He took it wordlessly, but his eyes met hers with something quiet and full behind them. "I found your book," she said, settling onto the bench against the wall. "The one with the pressed fern between the pages. I thought I'd left it in Arizona. You packed it beneath the tins." He nodded, blowing across the top of the cup. "I used to press plants when I was riding alone. Gave me something to look for besides trouble." "Why the fern?" "It was the first thing I picked after I stopped drinking." She looked down at her hands. "I didn't know you had. I don't talk about it much." He sat across from her on the floor, back against the wall. "I lost a winter to it once. Woke up in a stranger's barn with a bloodied lip and no recollection of how I got there. I swore off it after that." She didn't speak, just watched the firelight flicker across the grain in the floorboards. "I don't want to be that man again," he added. "Not with you here." "You aren't," she said. He set the cup aside and stretched out his legs. "You ever think of writing anything down? You're always watching things." "I used to write letters I never sent," she said, "to my mother. She died when I was 15. Sometimes I still think about what I'd tell her now." "What would you?" "That I'm not running anymore, that I wake up knowing what the day will ask of me and I don't dread it." He leaned his head back against the wall. "I'd like to read one of those letters someday." She folded her hands in her lap. "Maybe I'll write one for you." He looked over at her. "I'd keep it." They didn't say more after that. The wind howled once outside, then stilled again. The fire cracked low in the hearth, throwing a slow rhythm into the quiet. When she stood to bank the coals, Ransom rose too, stepping behind her. His hands didn't reach for her, but the space between them shifted, close and warm. "You said once I was free," she murmured. "I meant it." "I believe you now," she said, "but I don't want to be free from you." She turned, and this time it was her hand that found his fingers laced, firm and certain. He brought her hand to his chest, right over the beat of his heart. There was no rush in the gesture, only the weight of something whole. "I want to build this life with you," she said. He didn't answer with words. He just leaned in and rested his brow to hers, breathing in the space they'd made together. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and without sound. Inside, two hearts beat steady in the warmth of something new, something earned. And for the first time in either of their lives, nothing felt unfinished. By late October, the cabin held its own against the season's change. Smoke rose steady from the chimney, and the roof shook only slightly in the wind, no longer groaning under its own weight. Inside, the air stayed warm even when the frost thickened on the window panes. The pine walls breathed out their own quiet scent, and Mabel had begun hanging sprigs of dried sage along the doorframe, more for calm than for keeping out the cold. She stood barefoot on the plank floor, twisting a rope of wool she'd carded herself. The rhythm soothed her, even as her fingers ached with the tug and pull. Ransom was out near the edge of the eastern field, walking the boundary where he planned to build a second fence come spring. He'd taken Flint and the tool satchel, promising to be back before the sun dropped behind the ridge. By the hearth, A small kettle hissed. She'd boiled rose hips and dried apple peel into a thin syrup and poured it into a crock, letting it cool as she worked. The days had taken on a shape now, each one folded cleanly into the next. There was comfort in that, not the kind that dulled a person, but the kind that steadied them. She'd never known it before. The door creaked open behind her and Ransom stepped inside, boots dusted with frost, collar turned high. "I saw elk prints near the edge of the slope," he said, hanging his coat. "3 sets, maybe more," she nodded. "We could dry what we don't eat, hang it in the loft." He walked over and kissed the side of her head. "That's what I was thinking." She turned to face him. "You always this agreeable?" "Only when I'm listened to." She arched an eyebrow. "You're listened to plenty." He leaned one hip against the table. "Then maybe I've gone soft from good fortune." She set the wool aside and poured him a cup of the syrup from the crock. He took a sip, frowned thoughtfully, then took another. "Tastes like early autumn," he said. She wiped her hands on her apron. "It's what we've got till the preserves finish setting. I'll trade with the widow in the valley for sugar." He looked at her closely. "You don't talk about trading much." "Thought you didn't like the idea of owing favors." She opened the cupboard and began stacking the jars of beans she'd shelled earlier. "I don't. But she's alone, and I know what that feels like. Besides, she's got a boy. 6, maybe 7. He watches her like he's waiting for something to go wrong." Ransom set down the cup. "Sounds familiar. I want to give her something without her having to ask." He crossed the room and picked up a jar, examining the neat cloth tied around the lid. "You've been thinking ahead. I've been thinking we need people. Not many, but a few." He nodded slowly. "Then we'll make room at the table." The wind outside picked up, rattling the shutters once before settling. Mabel stepped to the hearth and banked the fire, then crossed to the window. Snow had begun to fall again, a fine dusting that clung to the edges of the sill. "We should build the bed frame," she said without turning. "I'm tired of sleeping with my back against wagon boards." He stepped behind her, his hands settling light on her waist. "You say that like we don't have a whole house now." She leaned back into him. "It's not about the house. No, it's about choosing to be still." His voice was warm against her hair. "You're still with me." She turned in his arms. "I want to plant here, not just the field." "I mean us." He pressed his forehead to hers. "Then we'll root deep." That night they laid out the frame together, working by lamplight. Ransom measured and cut while Mabel sanded the edges smooth. The pine smelled clean and the boards fit without protest. By the time they finished, the stars outside had climbed high, and both their hands were lined with sawdust and glue. They slept in the new bed that night, wrapped in the wool blanket she'd stitched from old coats. It wasn't grand, but it held the shape of them, and that was enough. Winter came in earnest the next morning, laying a white hush over the valley. The days shortened, and the cold grew sharp. But their days stayed full, hauling wood, tending the stove, stitching clothes from old flour sacks. Ransom carved a set of wooden spoons and surprised her with a comb made from scrap antler. She held it like it was something sacred. One evening, near the close of December, she found him sitting on the porch step, sharpening his hunting knife. His breath curled in the air. "You always sharpening something," she said. He looked up. "Keeps my hands from turning useless." She sat beside him. "You think marriage is like that?" He blinked. "You asking me to marry you?" She pulled a folded scrap of paper from her pocket. "I wrote your name beside mine." "I think that counts." He looked down at her handwriting, deliberate and careful, as if each letter had been earned. "I'll build us a table for the wedding dinner," he said. "I'll make the bread." They were married 3 days later, with snow still on the ground and the sky clear as glass. The widow from the valley came, bringing her boy and a pie made from dried cherries. They stood in the warmth of the cabin, hands joined, no preacher but the truth between them. That night, as they lay in bed, Mabel traced the lines of Ransom's palm with her fingers. "You feel like home," she whispered. He kissed her knuckles one by one. "You are mine." Years passed quiet and sure. The fields yielded greens, then wheat, then squash. The boy from the valley came by on horseback most Saturdays, learning to mend boots under Ransom's eye. Mabel began writing again, small pages she folded and tucked into a wooden box. Not letters, exactly, but pieces of the life she'd never imagined possible. She never looked back toward Dry Creek. She didn't have to. By the time the second spring bloomed across the valley, The fence posts had aged to a soft gray, and the porch Ransom had once imagined stood wide and strong, a bench running the length of it. Some evenings they sat there without words, her head on his shoulder, his thumb tracing idle circles on her wrist. And in the hush of those moments, when the wind carried the scent of river water and turned the grass gold in the light, they knew. Every choice, every scar, every mile that led them here had been worth it. They had rooted, and they had bloomed.